When the Chicago drill movement first started popping off, bodies were dropping like flies and it was like nothing the world had ever seen before. Fans were living vicariously through their favorite rappers. The entire city was divided into different cliques and gangs, and they were fighting for territory and respect. Before getting into the crazy story of the legendary Caucasian who was in the mix of all the chaos, I'm going to break down all the different sets so you guys have an idea of what was happening during this time. Of the most famous sets you had, the infamous set 051 Young Money, who is beefing with almost all of Chicago. The main ops were Wick City 600 and THF 46 and countless more. These guys started off as basketball players but turned into deadly drillers you didn't want to play with. When thinking about their most famous members, one of the first people that come to mind is 051 Drilla. He's an extremely talented rapper with countless songs with millions of views that deserves to be mainstream. Next up we have 051 Kiddo. He is described by his own guys as being a loose screw and not all the way there upstairs. This man lives and breathes Chicago gangbanging. After being involved in countless drive-bys and robberies, he was eventually sent to jail. He was sent for more than 10 years, and during his time in the pen he was getting in countless fights and was repping his set to the fullest. After serving 10 years along with 4 months and 24 days, he was finally released, but came out the exact same guy dropping diss songs and taunting the ops. After catching the attention of media outlets and stamping himself a drill legend, unfortunately he was caught with a blower and was sent back to jail. And then we have the legendary stepper, a man who put fear in the hearts of everyone living in Chicago, 051 Melly. Because I do not want to potentially incite any violence, we will not get into the specifics of any potential bodies that they have, but just know that they are believed to be responsible for a lot of the chaos happening in Chicago. But out of respect for the families of the young men who are no longer with us, we will not drop any of the names of who they are responsible for. Next on our list full of famous rappers, the legendary set and LMB. Unlike Young Money, these guys have a number of different allies, the most famous being Front Street, O Block 600 and a couple more. But with allies comes ops, and they were into it with Lakeside, Black Mob, Death Row, and countless more sets throughout Chicago. When thinking about the most famous members in this set, the first person that comes to mind is superstar rapper G Herbo. Bro has a net worth of over 3 million and has had a huge impact on mainstream culture. Next on our list, legendary rapper and producer Lil Bibby. Even though he's got a good amount of songs with over 20 million views, his biggest impact on the culture was his ability to recognize talent. Bro literally brought us Juice WRLD and was his manager. Bro has always been a hustler and now has a net worth of 14 million. Next on our list, an LMB Chiraw. Because of his outgoing personality, he has been all over the blogs and has been making a name for himself. Then last but certainly not least, we have Mad Max. He had a reputation as a well-known stepper and was believed to be responsible for a lot of the chaos during this time. And then we've got one of the most famous sets in all of Chicago, the infamous Gang 600. These guys are clicked up with O Block, Front Street, Lamarin, and a few more sets, and were part of the deadly beef that captivated the attention of the entire world and completely changed culture in the United States. These guys are into it with Young Money, who we mentioned earlier, Yarrow City, Taekwon World, and STL. Even though they are into it with countless other sets, the back and forth with STL was the war that captured the hearts of Americans. The most famous members are Rondo No. 9, who is now serving life in prison after chipping a cab driver, with another famous member, C-Day, who is the brother of drill legend D-Day, who tragically passed away after turning his life around and becoming a contributing member of society. And then there's Ella Capone, who had the talent to go mainstream and make it big had his life not gotten cut short at the young age of 17. And then we have the most famous set of them all, the legendary Gang O Block. Their allies are 600 THF for 6, Blackgate, Lamarin, and a bunch more. And the most famous back and forth of them all is their beef with STL, but they're also into it with Taekwon World, Yarrow City, and a bunch more cliques. Of the many famous members, the first that comes to my mind is the rapper and blogger Boss Top. And then there's the legendary stepper, a man who put fear in the hearts of his rivals and everyone living in Chicago, T-Roy. And you can't mention O Block without mentioning rap superstar and a man described as being rap's first serial killer, King Von. And then the most famous drill rapper of them all, the guy who started everything, Chief Keef. And then on the other side with STL, their allies are Yarrow City, Brick Squad, Wooga World, Taekwon World, and a couple more. And they're into it with O Block, 600, Lamarin, and a bunch more sets throughout Chicago. And the most famous members are Billionaire Black, who spent some time in a wheelchair but recently gained his ability to walk again. FBG Butta, who has been all over major platforms doing interviews and getting millions of views. His biological sister Ki, who was a real stepper and was responsible for a lot of destruction during this time. And then you've got Little J, also known as the Chicago Mechanic. When the mechanic was not in the shop with Transformers, he was known to be quite the backdoor driller. And then we've got FBG Cash, who right after he was starting to make it mainstream, he was set up and backdoored by a girl he was messing with, and his biological brother rapper FBG Dutchy, and their other brother FBG Young. Then there's Ruga, who has had countless hit songs and was even featured on a song with Kanye West. There's FBG Wooski, who got lit up outside a funeral but lived and is still rapping to this day. And then there is FBG Brick, who tragically passed away. And FBG Duck, who lost his life on a crazy hit similar to the Mafia that captured the attention of all of Chicago. But there's one person who is always left off lists but was deep in the mix of everything: FBG White Boa. He grew up in the middle of the hood around the infamous gang PBG. From a young age, he was a different breed of white boy, and that became very evident to the guys in his neighborhood, and he became close buddies with drill legend Young Pappy. Him and Young Pappy would kick it together, blow tree and bust traps, and he starts to make a bunch of plug connections in the underground dealings of Chicago. Eventually, after getting to know all these different plugs and having a connect for everything, he starts strapping himself and is bringing in thousands of dollars per week. He was serving to a bunch of different hoods and was making a bunch of connections while doing so. He first came on to the drill scene because he was a trapper and could get you anything you wanted. He was dealing in arms and pharmaceuticals. Here is a video of him and Chicago driller turned comedian FYBJ Main during this time. He was trapping lean along with bud, along with bars and even ice and blow, and most importantly a bunch of yerks. And once billionaire black an individual who loves indulging in the pharmaceuticals caught wind of this new plug, he grabbed a bunch off him, and through this transaction they started hanging out and building a friendship. He was coming around on a regular basis during this time, and during one of his drops he ran into the Chicago mechanic Little J. Him and Little J had an instant connection and became boys and started hanging out and were popping bars almost every day. When Little J first started posting pics of him and FBG White Boa, people were clowning him and accusing him of trying to be like Chief Keef, who was hanging out with Little Flash during this time. But he didn't care, and it's through the mechanic that he met FBG Buddha. And now the three of them were hanging out daily, getting into trouble and taking lots of pharmaceuticals. And all this was taking place during the deadly back and forth with O-Block and STLEBT. This beef was absolutely terrorizing the streets of Chicago, and everyone was tuning in from the United States to Switzerland. This was like nothing the world had ever seen. The music was reflecting exactly what was going on in the streets. This is not confirmed, but according to rumors, White Boa earned the ability to put FBG in front of his name after going on a couple missions drilling on the ops. Despite what you want to say about Little J, all jokes aside, he was a savage that would do anything for his set, and during this time him and FBG White Boa were in full crash out mode. And things were heating up in the streets, and they were indulging in more and more pharmaceuticals to cope with the stress of having to look behind your back everywhere you went, and the pain of losing so many friends and loved ones. These guys were into it with 13 different sets, so there was lots of sleepless nights for FBG White Boa, who stuck out like a sore thumb. But he was also really from the streets and was from PBG's hood and was responsible for introducing some of the guys from STL to PBG. Him along with his buddies from PBG would be hanging out with his boys from FBG and playing dice and sparking J's. He was known to bring people together and was the link between different hoods. He had connections all throughout Chicago, but was also struggling with addiction and was popping over 3 bars a day. As the pharmaceutical use increased, he became more and more reckless. To feed his addiction, he had become a full-on jack boy and was setting people up and robbing everything in sight. Bro was robbing all the plugs, and eventually his reckless behavior was going to catch up with him, and unfortunately it did. On a cold Chicago night, him and 2 of his boys went to hit a lick, but this time they picked a plug that was not going for it and was ready for all the smoke. They were strapped up when they left, but so was the plug, and this resulted in the young man tragically passing away. Just like anyone else growing up in the trenches, Bro became a product of his environment and turned to substances and gangs to cope with his surroundings. He did a lot to try and bring different hoods together, and had he still been around, he would have definitely gone mainstream and been all over major platforms like No Jumper and Say Cheese. RIP FBG White Boa, you died a legend.